If anyone hears this transmission, it means the cold has already claimed everything it was allowed to touch. On the outer edge of the Helion ice field, silence was not peace but pressure, a living weight pressing down on fractured metal and frozen ground, where even sound seemed to hesitate before existing. Lyris Vale had stopped trying to measure time after the first night, because on a world like this hours did not pass. They endured, each one identical, each one colder than the last, and she sat now with her back against a ridge of ice, her breathing slow and shallow as her suit's remaining systems flickered between warning and resignation. Somewhere far above, orbital systems marked her as inactive, unimportant, outside priority corridors, but she was still there, still awake in the way that mattered when survival becomes less about strength and more about refusal to disappear. Ethan Carter was not supposed to be anywhere near this sector. His assignment was routine maintenance for remote relay stations, the kind of work that kept larger operations stable but never made headlines. Yet his patrol route had deviated after a faint signal pulse cut through static like a heartbeat in a dead room, and his transport slowed as his instruments struggled to interpret what they were seeing. The onboard intelligence spoke in calm procedural language, advising disengagement, noting unknown biological signature, recommending no contact under interstellar safety protocol. But Ethan stared at the distortion on his display and felt something simpler than protocol, something that did not have a formal name, only weight. Outside his reinforced canopy, the world was white and endless, a flat expanse broken only by wind-carved shapes and drifting frost that moved like memory across the surface. And when he finally stepped down onto the ice, the temperature sensors on his suit adjusted instantly to conditions far below comfortable human tolerance. Yet he kept walking because the signal was not moving anymore. He found her partially obscured near a ridge, not collapsed in dramatic fashion, but folded into stillness as if the planet itself had convinced her to pause. And for a moment he did not move, because every trained system in his environment suit was telling him to wait for confirmation. But the sight of her hand, barely visible against the snow, shifted that hesitation into action. Ethan lowered himself carefully, his breath visible in short, controlled bursts, and the moment his gloves touched her shoulder, he understood she was still there, still holding on in a way that defied efficiency metrics and survival probability charts. And the AI repeated its warning in his ear, colder than the wind outside, but he muted it without thinking. He lifted her with deliberate care, adjusting her weight against his armored frame, feeling the faint residual heat of life where everything else around them had surrendered to frost. And as he turned back toward his transport, the storm seemed to grow quieter, as if even the planet was listening to the decision he had just made, because in that moment there was no rescue protocol active. Only a human carrying something the world had already decided to forget, and in that silence something fragile began to change between survival and mercy itself without either of them knowing yet. The transport doors hissed open with a controlled release of heated air that felt almost unreal against the frozen world outside, and Ethan Carter stepped inside first while carefully adjusting the weight of the alien woman in his arms, feeling the contrast between the storm biting at his suit and the fragile stillness of her condition, as if she belonged to a temperature the universe no longer provided in this place. And the onboard system immediately registered life form stabilization. Priority, shifting internal power routing toward environmental recovery protocols, while a calm synthetic voice recommended standard isolation procedure until classification was complete. But Ethan did not slow down, moving instead through the narrow corridor lined with utility panels and emergency equipment until he reached the medical bay designed for human physiology, already aware that none of it had been built with her in mind. The lighting inside was soft and steady, a stark contrast to the violent white outside, and as he lowered her onto the stabilization platform, the system hesitated, scanning unfamiliar biological readings that did not match any cataloged Terran species, let alone anything from standard interstellar registries. And for a brief moment the room filled with diagnostic uncertainty markers that flickered across transparent displays like distant warnings without urgency, waiting for authorization that Ethan manually overrode. He adjusted the temperature controls upward in small increments, careful not to shock her system, and activated auxiliary thermal diffusion fields usually reserved for extreme cold exposure recovery. watching as faint indicators of her condition stabilized by fractions that felt less like data and more like permission for hope, while outside the wind continued to move across the ice field as if nothing had changed at all. Her skin carried a faint luminescence under the internal lighting, not bright, but subtle like reflected starlight through thin ice. And her breathing remained shallow, yet steady enough to suggest that the line between survival and silence had not yet been crossed completely. And Ethan found himself studying the unfamiliar structure of her features not with curiosity alone, but with the same focus he would use when repairing something essential that had been neglected too long. The system finally produced a classification attempt, labeling her as unknown xenobiological entity with cryogenic adaptation markers. But the certainty level remained low and recommended external authority consultation, which in practical terms meant waiting for a response that might never come in time, and Ethan disabled the advisory feed entirely, choosing instead to rely on direct observation and incremental adjustment. He retrieved a thermal blanket from the emergency storage and wrapped it around her with deliberate care, ensuring even distribution of heat, then monitored her response through the biometric interface, noting how her system reacted not with panic, but with gradual acceptance, as if warmth itself was something remembered rather than introduced. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the transport's internal circulation system and the distant vibration of atmospheric interference against the hull, and Ethan stood beside the platform with his hands resting lightly on the edge, feeling the exhaustion of the environment and the quiet pressure of responsibility settling in without announcement. He did not know who she was, what classification she carried, or what consequences would follow this deviation from protocol, but he understood something simpler in that moment, that leaving her outside had never been a neutral option, and as her breathing steadied by another subtle degree and the system confirmed minimal but stable recovery, the cold logic of the mission shifted into something less defined, something that no chart or directive had accounted for, while the storm outside continued to erase every trace of where she had been until only the fact of her survival inside this small heated space remained as the first irreversible change in an otherwise unchanged universe. The first coherent signal she produced was not speech, but a sequence of soft, irregular pulses detected through the medical interface, as if her body was testing the boundary between unconsciousness and awareness in the same way a stranded traveler tests ice before stepping forward. And Ethan Carter leaned closer to the diagnostic display, watching as the system attempted to interpret patterns that did not belong to any known human physiological language, while the transport vessel remained locked in quiet stability, anchored against the relentless motion of the storm outside. The temperature inside the medical bay had been raised to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a level comfortable for human recovery. Yet he noticed subtle fluctuations in her biometric response, suggesting her biology was adapting rather than resisting, as if warmth was not foreign to her, but simply forgotten over time, and that thought carried an unspoken weight he did not immediately name. The onboard intelligence attempted another classification update, now flagging her as potentially sentient non-human origin with structured cognitive activity, but it added uncertainty margins so large they rendered the classification nearly meaningless and recommended immediate communication attempt under controlled conditions, though it offered no guidance on how to communicate with something that had never been spoken to in recorded human language systems. Ethan ignored the recommendation delay and instead adjusted the lighting to a softer spectrum, reducing harsh reflections that might interfere with sensory recovery, then positioned a basic translation interface nearby, not because he expected it to work, but because it represented the only bridge between silence and understanding available to him. Minutes passed in measured stillness until her fingers moved slightly against the thermal fabric, not in panic but in slow recognition, and her eyes opened halfway, revealing a faint glow that reflected the internal lighting like distant ice catching morning sun. And for a brief moment, she did not move further, as if evaluating whether awareness itself was safe in this environment. Ethan stepped back slightly to avoid overwhelming her senses, keeping his posture open and non-threatening, relying on instinct more than training, because no protocol had ever covered this exact scenario, and the ship's systems quietly logged the interaction as first contact behavioral observation. Her gaze eventually settled on him, not sharply but with cautious focus. And though there were no shared words yet, something in the way she tracked his movement suggested recognition of presence rather than identity, as if she understood that he was the variable that had interrupted an otherwise final equation. The interface attempted passive linguistic sampling, broadcasting neutral tonal patterns into the space between them, but her reaction was minimal, limited to a slight head tilt that indicated awareness without comprehension, and Ethan realized that communication might not begin with translation at all, but with repetition, consistency, and time. Outside the vessel, wind patterns shifted across the ice field, reshaping the surface into new formations that erased any trace of earlier footprints, and the contrast between that erasure and the preserved space inside the ship felt more significant with each passing minute, as if the boundary between survival and absence had become physically measurable through temperature and containment alone. He checked the external sensors again, confirming that no additional life signatures were approaching, only environmental instability continuing its endless cycle, and then returned his attention to her condition, noting that her breathing had stabilized further, now following a rhythm that suggested recovery rather than endurance. She attempted another small movement, this time lifting her hand slightly before letting it rest again, and the system recorded the gesture as non-hostile exploratory behavior, though Ethan already understood it differently, not as data, but as intention forming slowly within unfamiliar constraints. He remained where he was, neither closing distance nor withdrawing further, allowing the space between them to exist without pressure, because something about the situation demanded patience rather than intervention. And as the storm continued its silent pressure against the hull, the first fragile structure of mutual awareness began forming not through language or instruction, but through the simple fact that neither of them had turned away when they could have. The moment she fully regained consciousness did not arrive like a sudden awakening, but rather like a gradual return of presence, as if Lyris Vale was assembling herself from scattered fragments of awareness, one careful thought at a time. And Ethan Carter observed quietly as the diagnostic interface registered incremental stabilization in her neural activity, each reading shifting closer to coherence, though still far from anything the system could confidently interpret. The medical bay remained unchanged in structure, yet different in feeling, because silence was no longer absolute. It now carried anticipation, the kind that forms when uncertainty begins to organize itself into possibility. Her eyes tracked him again, this time with more stability, following the subtle movement of his hands as he adjusted a nearby sensor array. And there was a brief pause where neither of them acted, as if both were waiting for permission that neither fully understood how to give. The onboard intelligence attempted another communication protocol, projecting a soft neutral tone designed to minimize stress responses in unknown species, but the effect was minimal, producing only a slight shift in her gaze toward the source of sound, suggesting she was processing input rather than reacting to it instinctively. Ethan noticed this and adjusted the interface output, lowering frequency variance, simplifying pattern repetition, not because he had training in xenolinguistics, but because he understood patterns of learning in the most fundamental human way, through repetition and patience. Outside the vessel, the storm continued its unbroken movement across the ice field, yet inside, time felt increasingly separated from that environment, as if the transport had become its own isolated ecosystem where survival was no longer about endurance against elements, but about understanding something entirely unfamiliar. Lyris moved her hand again, this time more deliberately, lifting it slightly off the thermal surface before placing it back down, and the system recorded structured exploratory behavior, but Ethan interpreted it as something closer to intention forming into action, a tentative attempt at communication without language. He slowly reached toward a small portable display unit and activated a simple visual interface, showing a basic sequence of light pulses intended to represent presence without threat, and he waited without stepping closer, giving her space to process the unfamiliar pattern. Her response came after several seconds of stillness, when she mirrored a slight variation in the rhythm, not identical but close enough to suggest recognition of structure, and for the first time the system flagged the interaction as potential reciprocal communication pattern emerging. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief exactly, but in acknowledgement that something had shifted from observation into interaction, a boundary crossed without force or intention, only patience. Lyris tilted her head slightly, studying him more intently now, and though no translation was possible yet, there was a subtle change in her expression that suggested she was no longer simply assessing environment, but beginning to associate him with continuity, with the absence of harm, with the persistence of presence. The interface attempted to map this behavioral shift into probability models, but the uncertainty margins remained too large for meaningful classification, and Ethan disabled predictive overlays again, preferring raw observation over interpretation that could mislead action. He checked her vitals once more, confirming continued stabilization, then stepped slightly to the side to retrieve a small container of nutrient solution designed for human recovery but adaptable for general metabolic support, and he placed it within her reach without forcing engagement. She looked at the container, then back at him, and this time the pause between action and reaction was shorter, as if trust was being tested not in abstract terms, but in immediate physical reality. The storm outside continued its endless cycle of erasure, but inside the transport something irreversible had begun forming. Not yet understanding, not yet language, but recognition that presence could exist without threat, and in that fragile space between unfamiliar biology and simple human choice, the first true step toward communication had finally taken shape. The first time she accepted the nutrient solution, it was not with trust, but with careful observation, as if every action carried weight beyond its visible form, and Lyris Vale studied the container in Ethan Carter's hand for several seconds before extending her fingers slowly, not rushing, not withdrawing, simply testing the space between intention and consequence. And when her hand finally made contact, the onboard system recorded a stable interaction pattern without stress indicators for the first time since her recovery began. Ethan did not move closer, only adjusted his stance slightly to remain visible without overwhelming her field of focus, because something in the subtle shift of her attention suggested that visibility mattered more than proximity, and he understood instinctively that unfamiliar beings often define safety not by distance, but by predictability. She examined the container, then tilted it slightly, watching the liquid move inside with quiet fascination, and the system attempted another interpretive scan, labeling the behavior as cognitive curiosity rather than survival response, though it still lacked confidence in classification. Ethan activated a simple interface panel nearby, displaying a single steady light pulse repeated at consistent intervals, not language, not instruction, only rhythm, and he watched as her gaze shifted toward it, then back to him, then again to the light, as if connecting patterns that existed without translation. For several minutes, nothing changed except this exchange of attention, a quiet negotiation between unfamiliar systems of perception, and the storm outside the vessel continued its endless movement across the ice field, indifferent and unchanged, while inside the transport something far more fragile was forming, not communication yet, but the conditions required for it. Lyris finally lifted the container fully, bringing it closer to her, not drinking yet, only holding it at chest level as if measuring its meaning before its use, and Ethan noticed that her breathing had stabilized further, no longer shallow with strain, but steady in a rhythm that suggested recovery had shifted into adaptation. The onboard intelligence suggested initiating structured contact protocols, offering a set of standardized visual and auditory sequences designed for first contact diplomacy. But Ethan dismissed the recommendation again, recognizing that structure too early might fracture the fragile consistency they had established, and instead he maintained the simple pulse interface, unchanged, patient. Lyris suddenly mirrored the rhythm again, not perfectly, but with deliberate variation, and this time the system registered a higher probability of intentional replication, marking it as emergent communicative behavior, though still without linguistic mapping. Ethan felt something shift in the quiet certainty of the room, not dramatic, not immediate, but foundational, like the first alignment of pieces that had not yet revealed the shape they were forming. She finally drank from the container in small measured amounts, pausing between each sip as if testing internal response, and when she finished, she lowered it carefully rather than releasing it, placing it beside her with intentional care that the system interpreted as controlled motor recovery, but Ethan recognized as something closer to respect for the object itself. Their eyes met again, and this time the silence between them did not feel like absence, but like shared focus, as if both were aware that something unspoken was beginning to stabilize into structure. Ethan slowly extended his hand toward the interface again, restarting the same pulse pattern, and after a brief hesitation, she responded once more, matching it with a slight delay, not exact, but consistent enough to confirm learning rather than coincidence. And in that moment, the distance between them stopped being measured in physical space and instead became something less tangible, something defined by understanding that was still forming but no longer uncertain in its direction. Outside, the storm continued to erase everything it touched, but inside the transport, repetition became recognition, and recognition became the first quiet agreement that neither of them would turn away while the other was still learning how to remain. The shift did not announce itself with any clear signal, but rather emerged through repetition that had begun to stabilize into something resembling understanding. As Lyris Vale continued to observe the pulse interface and mirror its rhythm with increasing consistency, while Ethan Carter maintained the same controlled pattern without variation, because he had learned that stability mattered more than speed when building trust across unknown boundaries. And the medical bay remained quiet except for the soft environmental systems maintaining temperature at a steady 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Her posture had changed slightly since the first interaction, no longer rigid with survival tension, but still careful, as if every movement required confirmation from an internal process he could not see. And the onboard intelligence recorded this as adaptive recovery behavior, while simultaneously flagging the interaction as unresolved communicative development, still lacking a linguistic anchor. Ethan checked external conditions briefly, confirming that the storm outside had intensified slightly, with wind speeds increasing across the ice field to levels that would have made any surface exposure dangerous within minutes. And yet inside the vessel, there was only controlled stillness, a contained environment where two entirely different systems of life were slowly negotiating shared presence. Lyris raised the nutrient container again, not to drink this time, but to examine it more closely, rotating it in her hand with careful attention to detail, and Ethan noticed that her focus had expanded beyond immediate survival cues into structural curiosity, as if she was beginning to categorize objects rather than simply respond to them. The interface attempted another minimal communication sequence, adding a secondary pulse pattern slightly offset from the first, and after a short delay, she responded not by matching exactly, but by introducing a variation that followed the structure while altering its timing, and the system immediately logged this as probable cognitive experimentation rather than instinctive mimicry. Ethan felt the significance of that distinction without needing the system to explain it, because repetition alone was one thing, but variation inside repetition implied recognition of pattern ownership, the beginning of intentional expression rather than passive response. He slowly adjusted the interface display, adding a second light positioned several inches apart from the first, creating a spatial relationship between signals rather than a single rhythm, and he watched her reaction carefully as her eyes tracked both points of light, moving between them with measured attention that suggested she was mapping relationship rather than simply observing stimulus. For several seconds she did not respond, and then she lifted her hand slightly, extending one finger toward the nearer light, pausing just before contact, as if confirming safety through proximity rather than touch, and Ethan did not move or interrupt, allowing the moment to exist without pressure. When she finally touched the interface surface, the system registered a stable input confirmation, and the lights briefly synchronized before returning to their original alternating pattern, and her gaze remained fixed on them longer than before, indicating sustained engagement. Ethan realized then that communication was no longer theoretical in this space. It was becoming procedural, something built step by step through repetition and mutual adjustment. And although no words had been exchanged, the structure of interaction was beginning to resemble the earliest form of shared understanding. Outside, the ice field remained unchanged in its hostility, but inside the transport the boundary between isolation and connection had begun to thin, not through force or instruction, but through the quiet accumulation of consistent behavior. And as Lyris continued to study the lights with increasing focus, Ethan maintained the pattern without deviation, aware that in this fragile equilibrium, even the smallest change could redefine everything they were beginning to build. The first interruption to the emerging pattern was so subtle that it almost went unnoticed, beginning as a faint instability in Lyris Vale's breathing rhythm, a deviation so small that the onboard system initially classified it as normal variance in post-recovery adaptation, but Ethan Carter noticed it immediately because he had been watching for consistency rather than perfection. And any break in consistency carried meaning in a system that was still learning how to express itself. Her hand, which had been hovering near the interface lights moments before, slowly lowered to the thermal blanket, and her eyes shifted away from the synchronized pulses toward a fixed point in the middle distance, as if something within her perception had turned inward rather than outward, and the system responded by flagging mild neurological fluctuation, still within acceptable recovery range, but no longer fully stable. Ethan adjusted his posture slightly, not moving closer, but reducing environmental stimulus by dimming the interface lights by 10%, attempting to reduce cognitive load without breaking the established pattern completely. And for a few seconds there was no response at all from her side, only stillness that felt heavier than silence had before. Then, without warning, she exhaled more deeply than she had at any point since awakening, and the rhythm that had been forming between them collapsed for a moment into irregularity, as if the structure they had built was being examined from the inside rather than the outside. The onboard intelligence immediately suggested reinitializing first contact protocols, warning that cognitive overload or emotional destabilization could occur in unknown xenobiological recovery cycles. But Ethan ignored it again, because what he was observing did not resemble breakdown. It resembled recalibration. Lyris turned her head slightly toward him, not fully focused but no longer detached, and her gaze carried a different weight now, less analytical and more uncertain, as if she had reached the limit of pattern recognition without arriving at translation. Ethan slowly deactivated one of the interface lights entirely, leaving only a single pulse remaining, and the room shifted perceptually, no longer defined by symmetry, but by singular focus, and he watched carefully as her eyes adjusted to the change. After several seconds, she raised her hand again, but this time the movement was not directed toward the light. Instead, it hovered briefly in the air between them, uncertain, suspended, and then lowered again to rest against the blanket. And the system logged this as hesitation behavior with no clear classification. Ethan understood it differently, not as rejection but as transition, because the repetition they had built was no longer sufficient on its own. Something new had to be added or the structure would remain incomplete. He reached slowly toward the interface and changed the pulse pattern entirely, not adding complexity, but removing it, shifting from dual rhythm to a single steady interval that no longer alternated or varied, and the change was immediate in its effect on the room, because Lyris's attention locked onto the new signal with increased intensity, as if simplicity itself had restored clarity where structure had previously become uncertain. The onboard system registered this as improved engagement stability, but Ethan recognized it as something more fragile, the moment where understanding was no longer about matching patterns but about accepting them as shared reference. Lyris finally moved again, not mirroring this time, but simply observing without attempting response. And in that stillness there was a different kind of communication forming, one that did not rely on replication but on presence itself. Ethan remained still, maintaining the single pulse without variation, because he understood that at this stage any additional change would not build connection but fracture it. And outside the vessel the storm continued its relentless movement across the ice field, erasing all external reference points, while inside the transport a new kind of awareness was beginning to form that no system could yet name. But both of them were already beginning to recognize as the first stable boundary between isolation and understanding. The stability that had formed inside the transport did not remain unchanged, but instead entered a new phase where silence itself began to carry structure, and Lyris Vale sat now with her attention no longer shifting unpredictably, but instead resting on the single steady pulse Ethan Carter maintained, as if that rhythm had become the only reliable reference point in an otherwise unfamiliar environment. The onboard system confirmed continued physiological recovery, yet also noted increased cognitive engagement patterns that no longer matched passive observation, suggesting that her awareness had transitioned into a more active interpretive state, though still without identifiable linguistic output. Ethan observed this carefully, maintaining the same unchanged signal without deviation, because he understood that consistency was now more important than progression, and any attempt to accelerate understanding would likely destabilize what had been achieved through patience alone. Lyris slowly adjusted her position on the medical platform, not in discomfort, but in controlled movement, as if testing the boundaries of her own recovered physical awareness, and her gaze remained fixed on the interface light with a focus that had deepened into something more deliberate than curiosity. The system attempted another soft communication overlay, introducing a secondary harmonic tone beneath the visual pulse, but Ethan immediately recognized the change as unnecessary and disabled it before it could fully integrate, preserving the singular structure they had established. For several seconds nothing changed, and then Lyris made a small motion with her hand, not toward the interface but toward herself, touching her own chest lightly, as if referencing internal awareness rather than external stimulus. And the system logged this as self-referential cognition development, though its classification remained uncertain. Ethan did not interrupt this moment, because it was the first time her attention had turned inward rather than outward, and that shift represented a threshold that could not be forced or guided without risk of collapse. Outside the vessel, the ice field continued its relentless transformation under the storm, reshaping itself without memory or persistence. But inside the transport, the environment had become increasingly defined by continuity, by repeated presence that no longer needed reinforcement. Lyris eventually lifted her eyes from the light and looked directly at Ethan Carter, not with the analytical scanning behavior of earlier interactions, but with something quieter, more uncertain, as if she was now measuring him not as a system variable, but as a consistent element within her environment. The onboard intelligence attempted to interpret this shift as emergent social recognition behavior, but its confidence level remained low, unable to fully distinguish between learned pattern association and independent cognitive framing. Ethan held his position, neither approaching nor withdrawing, maintaining the steady pulse that had become their shared reference. And for the first time he noticed that she was no longer attempting to replicate it, but instead observing it while comparing it against her own internal rhythm, as if evaluating whether external structure matched internal experience. She moved her hand again, slowly, and this time she did not hesitate before placing it flat against the surface of the platform, grounding herself physically while continuing to watch the light, and the system recorded this as stabilized engagement with high confidence in recovery progression. Ethan exhaled quietly, not in relief but in recognition that the interaction had reached a point where silence itself was no longer empty. It was functional, carrying meaning that did not require translation. Lyris tilted her head slightly, and though no words were formed, there was a perceptible change in her expression that suggested acknowledgement rather than observation, as if she had begun to accept that the presence in front of her was not a temporary variable, but a fixed point in an otherwise unstable reality. The pulse continued without change, steady and unbroken, and within that repetition something deeper than communication was forming, not language yet, not understanding fully, but the earliest structure of trust built not from explanation, but from uninterrupted consistency, while the storm outside pressed endlessly against the hull, without ever breaching the quiet that had begun to define everything inside. The moment did not arrive as a sudden event, but as a gradual dissolution of uncertainty, when the steady pulse Ethan Carter maintained finally stopped feeling like a controlled signal and began to feel like a shared rhythm, and Lyris Vale remained still on the medical platform with her gaze fixed not on the light itself anymore, but on the space around it, as if she had begun to understand that meaning was not contained in the signal, but in the consistency of its return. The onboard intelligence recorded a final sequence of stabilization markers, noting that her physiological recovery had reached baseline compatibility thresholds, but its interpretive models were now less confident in labeling the interaction as recovery alone, instead suggesting emergent cross-cognitive alignment without precedent in known xenobiological encounters. Ethan did not react to the classification, because he had already moved beyond system interpretation and was instead observing the simple fact that she no longer seemed lost inside herself. Her attention no longer fractured between internal and external stimuli, but unified into a single continuous focus. Lyris slowly lifted her hand from the platform, and this time did not hesitate before extending it toward the interface light, not mirroring the rhythm, but interrupting it gently, placing her palm near the source without touching it. And in doing so, she altered the structure of the interaction for the first time since it began. The pulse did not stop, but it adapted, shifting slightly to accommodate her presence, and Ethan recognized that change immediately as reciprocal adjustment, not instruction, not imitation, but balance. Outside, the storm reached its peak intensity, wind shear crossing the ice field in patterns that erased all external reference points. But inside the transport, the environment had stabilized into something entirely different, where even silence carried measurable continuity. Lyris turned her head toward Ethan again, and this time her expression did not carry uncertainty or analysis, but something quieter, as if she had accepted that his presence was not temporary and not random, but persistent in a way that could be relied upon without explanation. The onboard system attempted a final communication recommendation, suggesting structured linguistic initiation protocols, but Ethan disabled it entirely because what was forming here had already moved beyond the need for procedural guidance. He slowly lowered the interface light until it dimmed into a softer ambient glow, and instead of breaking the connection, the reduction of intensity seemed to deepen it, as if clarity had been replaced by comprehension that did not depend on stimulus. Lyris exhaled slowly and placed her other hand flat against the platform again, grounding herself fully, and for the first time she looked directly at Ethan without tracking movement or scanning environment, simply holding eye contact in a way that suggested recognition without translation. Ethan did not speak, because speech would have introduced structure where structure was no longer necessary. And in that silence, the final boundary between observer and observed began to dissolve into shared presence. The system logged the interaction as stable, xenocognitive alignment, but its terminology failed to capture what was actually occurring, because this was no longer a recovery event, nor a first contact protocol, but something far more fundamental, a quiet agreement formed without language that neither of them would withdraw from the space they now shared. Outside the vessel, the universe continued its indifferent motion across the frozen world, but inside, the storm no longer defined reality, because reality had narrowed into a single contained moment where survival, awareness, and understanding had converged into the simple fact that neither of them was alone anymore.